This is video 3 in my series on music and AI. In this video, we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty of music. What is music? How is music? You got to understand music in its most primitive and basic foundational sense, and then build upon that in order to use AI with music effectively. And that will become increasingly obvious in the last video of this series. But bear with me through this video. It won't be more than 15 minutes, but we're going to get a little bit into the weeds with regard to music. What is music? I had a music theory, one of my very first music theory classes of any consequence was at Cal State Northridge with a gentleman named Skopsky, who was kind of infamous at the time. He kind of looked like the theory teacher from that old TV series Fame. He was a Eastern European guy. He always wore like a suit and tie to class. He took his music theory very, very seriously. He even invented his own kind of notation, which is kind of profound when you think about it. But I remember on day one of his class, he asked the class, "What is music?" And the students sort of sheepishly raised their hand and offered answers to that question, all of which were sort of inadequate, until he finally said, "Music is sound organized by humans." That is the most general definition of music. Music is sound organized by humans. So we're not talking about whale song. We're not talking about birds chirping in the trees. We're talking about sound organized by people when we talk about music. That could be something as abstract as John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where a pianist sits down at the piano bench, flips open the piano lid, and just sits there for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And in that case, the music is everything else going on around you. Cage was a Zen Buddhist, and he wanted people to really understand that music was happening around us all the time. So in that case, just the container of sound. That's sound being organized by humans. And that goes from all the way from that to, the spectrum of really complicated music, things like, works by the maximalist composers like, Charles Warren, or if you want to talk about the music of Carter or somebody like just stuff that's really crazy, difficult to wrap your head around. You don't even know why anybody calls it music. So that's the spectrum of sound organized by humans. But what does that mean? What is sound anyway? Let's dig a little deeper than that even. Let's ask ourselves, what is, what's sound? When we talk about sound, what is that phenomenon all about? So what is sound? You have pressure waves in the atmosphere. It hits your tympanic membrane. That vibrates sympathetically. That causes these three little bones in your inner ear to vibrate, which are attached to your cochlea, which is a big, long spiral tube full of fluid. That fluid in the cochlea vibrates sympathetically, which causes the hair in the organ of corti to vibrate, those little hairs that get damaged when you listen to music too loud. And those hairs basically trigger a neurochemical signal in your brain that your brain perceives as sound. Now, there are limits to what we can perceive as sound, and we'll talk about each of those thresholds respectively with regard to specific attributes of sound. What's the first and most important attribute of sound? Well, that would probably be duration. If sound doesn't persist in time, it cannot be perceived. What is the musical analog or corollary of duration? Well, that would be rhythm. Now, some people be inclined to say beat. It's important to understand that a beat is not a sound. Rhythm is sound. A beat is a felt periodicity. Whether you want to say you feel it somatically or some other way, but the reality is a beat isn't something that actually is audited with your ears. It's something that's felt with your body. Now, there's all kinds of rhythms and periodicities in nature with which we feel. We have a circadian rhythm. We can sort of sense when the sun comes up and comes down, even if we're in a room that doesn't have any windows. We're used to that period of time. It's sort of like programmed into our very DNA to a certain extent. There are other things, your heart. Well, the heartbeat does actually create a sound, but the feeling of an even gait, or all sorts of rhythms in nature. But beat is something that you feel, and not only that, something very interesting about beat, musical beat anyway, is that if those impulses are too far apart from one another, you can't really perceive it as a musical beat. Most humans can sense a beat when that periodicity is no greater than about 5 seconds. When the tempo slows down to the point where each impulse is more than 5 seconds apart, it's hard for the average human to actually even know if that's a regular or steady beat. So that's beat, but we're talking about rhythm. Rhythm is something you can hear. the sound persists in time for a certain period of time, in a certain order of, instances, certain length of instances, and that you perceive as rhythm, and that can induce the somatic feeling of a beat. So that's duration. We're talking about duration, musical equivalent, rhythm. The second property of sound that we need to talk about is the amplitude of the sound, how strong those pressure waves are in the atmosphere. The musical corollary of amplitude is dynamic. We're talking from no sound at all, niente, all the way to the loudest possible sound, forte possibile. That these things like piano, pianissimo, mezzo piano, mezzo forte, forte, fortissimo. These are words describing segmentations on a spectrum of amplitude. Think about that. So you've got time, which exists in a spectrum, of some we divide time up with our clocks and our watches and our metronomes, subdivisions of time, which is a continuous stream of phenomena, and likewise with amplitude, which is its own phenomena, and we divide that up with the words we use to describe it as well, whether you're talking about, like I said, forte or mezzo forte. And then the last property one of the last properties we talk about is frequency. How fast do those pressure waves come at you? And then now we're talking about hertz, or cycles per second, right? And the faster, the higher the hertz, the faster those pressure waves come at your ear, we perceive that as a higher frequency. And the musical corollary for that is pitch. So we've got duration, or rhythm, we've got amplitude, or dynamic, and we have frequency, or pitch. Very low pitches, you can get supersonic, too high for us to hear, subsonic, too low for us to hear, and you can even have like sonic weapons where the pitch is sufficiently low at an amplitude that's sufficiently strong that it scrambles your insides and makes you want to puke. So pitch and amplitude work together to create all sorts of interesting effects in the human body. Depending on how long, the dose would be the sort of duration, right? If music is a medicine, then duration is the dose, and or the amplitude. So these things all work together to create how we perceive sound, and how it impacts us, our physiology, and how it impacts us, emotionally and spiritually as well. Now, there's a fourth property of sound that sometimes is thought of as one of these primitives, like duration or amplitude or frequency, but it's really a combination. It's a combinatorial phenomenon of amplitude and frequency, at least from my point of view, and that would be timbre or tone color. By this, I'm talking about the difference between an oboe and a piano, between a clarinet and a flute, between the sound of my voice and the sound of my daughter's voice. This is tone color. Obviously my voice is deeper than my daughter's. That would be a difference in frequency. But the qualitative aspect of my voice would be tone color. The qualitative aspect of a flute compared to an oboe is its tone color. And that's a function of frequency and amplitude combined. Most pitches that we can hear, most instrumental sounds or vocal sounds that we hear, have a fundamental pitch that we can hear. Now, above that fundamental pitch, at varying degrees of amplitude that are just beyond the realm of immediate recognizability, would be their overtones. So, and those overtones start in nice whole number ratio relationships to the fundamental pitch. So like you might have a fundamental pitch of A440. It's an A in the middle octave of the piano, and then above that you'd have A880, which is twice as fast. Those frequencies move twice as fast. But if you start building this up, but don't just keep them all at the same amplitude, but lower the amplitude for the higher frequency, then it creates, in a combinatorial way, a different quality of sound, and that becomes tone color. When we're talking about voices, we can talk about formants, but essentially, in all cases, it is a ladder of ratio-related pitches with varying amplitudes, and most instruments have relatively constant or whole number ratio relationships in the lower or first members of that overtone series, and as you get into the higher overtones, you get more irrational number sort of relationships, less whole number relationships in those overtone series, and that creates the unique quality of sound that we all can identify with particular instruments or different people and all sorts of things. And then the combinatorial phenomenon of amplitude and frequency together in multineity, creating a unique tone color. Okay, so why did I go through this exercise of explaining this to you? The point is that you need to begin to think about music super articulately, from everything from, employing everything from your knowledge of acoustics to music theory when you begin to interact with artificial intelligence. Understand this. Now this is the big takeaway from this video. Sheet music is not music, right? Most of us have gotten to that level of maturity that we understand that what's on the page is not what necessarily is the totality of what the listener or ourselves experience as music, that the map is not the terrain. There was a great thinker earlier this century named Gregory Bateson who coined the phrase, the map is not the terrain. There's some other people that think another dude coined that, but I'm going to give Bateson credit for it. The map is not the terrain. Sheet music is just a set of instructions, right, that describe the sound that somebody ought to produce. And it's an actually quite low-res description of sound, right? The actual experience and phenomena of heard music, of a felt beat. These are things that are very information dense. If I made a map of my backyard that was really accurate, that map would have to be as big as my backyard to capture every little nook and cranny of it. So any kind of a map, whether you're talking about a physical map like a Thomas Brothers guide, or you're talking about your Google map or whatever, is an abstraction of the actual real thing that it represents. And likewise, sheet music is just an abstraction of musical sound. It's an abstraction layer of the sound, and a relatively low-res abstraction at that. But that's not the only abstraction layer you have for sound. You can actually use words as an abstraction layer for sound, just as I did with those three things, talking about duration and amplitude and frequency. These are words that are describing properties or attributes or features of sound. And that's all music theory is. Music theory is another abstraction layer of musical sound. Instead of using the symbology or the graphology of sheet music, you're using you're using language in lieu of those things. So as your ability to describe the music with a high degree of granularity, to describe things articulately through a formal use of acoustics and music theory, that will dictate how rich and how performant your abstraction layer is when you're trying to use words to create music. And in the next video, that's what I'm going to talk about, is using words to create music.